Welcome to Afrosphere. George Santayana, the Spanish-American philosopher, once said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Later on, Winston Churchill gave us this well-known variation: "Those that fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." America's declaration of trade war against the world is the clearest proof that there is a peculiar arrogance that threads itself through the fabric of empires, a blindness born not from a lack of vision, but from an excess of belief in one's own omnipotence. The war of nations, whether by military or economic means, is, in its basest form, a war of egos. One man's steadfast conviction that he can conquer beyond his means, that he can wage battle on all sides and emerge triumphant. It is the fatal mistake of history's most reckless despots, the Achilles heel of those who believe themselves beyond the forces of gravity that bind the solar system and the rest of mankind. Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump, one with armies, the other with tariffs, waged and wage multi-front wars in defiance of the lessons of history, and in both cases, the result is the slow unraveling of a once formidable empire. The doctrine of hubris and ignorance of limits. In the autumn of 1941, with the mechanized claws of the Wehrmacht sinking deep into Russian soil, Hitler basked in the illusion of invulnerability. The Western Front had been subdued, France lay prostrate, and the British, defiant yet bloodied, had not yet summoned the industrial might of their allies across the Atlantic. Emboldened by conquest, Hitler turned eastward, launching Operation Barbarossa, a campaign that would fracture the German war machine and doom his imperial ambitions. To the west, the Allied forces regrouped. To the east, the Soviet war machine lurches awake. In the Mediterranean, supply lines stretch thin. Germany was at war with the world, yet convinced of its own delusions of grandeur. Such hubris resulted in catastrophic miscalculations. 84 years later, in the gilded halls of economic power, Donald Trump is committing a crime of equal arrogance, not upon the battlefields of Europe, but upon the high seas of global commerce. In a bid to reforge the economic might of his republic, he is declaring war upon every major economic power simultaneously. Tariffs on China, the European Union, Mexico, Canada, Brazil, and India are being levied with a pen stroke, as if the world can be bent to the will of one man wielding a pen. It is true that the old wisdom says, "The pen is mightier than the sword." But people, let us be a little serious. Like Hitler, Trump believes in his own invincibility, convinced that the weight of the American economy is such that the world has no recourse but to kneel and kiss his ring. And like Hitler, he fails to grasp the nature of war itself. Warren Buffett was right. Trump's tariffs are acts of war, a world trade war. The Eastern Front, the fatal miscalculation. The Soviet Union, underestimated and reviled, was Hitler's undoing. He believed the Red Army was weak, the Russian winter surmountable, and the Slavic people incapable of resistance. Yet beneath the frost-laden fields of Stalingrad and Kursk, Germany's dreams of empire met an enemy that would not break. An adversary who could match attrition with attrition, manpower with manpower, iron with iron. Hitler's multi-front war crumbled first in the east, where Russia absorbed his blows and then struck back with the ferocity of a wounded beast. Look at the archives of war.
The German forces faced a relentless adversary in the form of General Winter, the unforgiving Soviet cold that earned its fearsome reputation. Adolf Hitler's grand plan was to conquer the Soviet Union before the bitter cold could take hold. But logistical challenges and a resilient Soviet resistance halted their advance at Moscow's doorstep in late 1941. Caught in the unyielding frost while still clad in summer uniforms, the German Wehrmacht had to resort to makeshift insulation using newspaper and straw, leading to an epidemic of frostbite with 100,000 reported cases by the end of 1941, resulting in nearly 15,000 limb amputations. The Soviet winter also wreaked havoc on German heavy machinery. Tanks and jeeps refused to start, and guns and artillery often succumbed to freezing temperatures. The Soviets, seasoned in the art of winter warfare, employed specially designed rifles, skis, and camouflage to persevere in the harshest conditions. The recurring deep freeze remained a constant challenge for the German armies throughout the war, but even the warmer months offered little respite. Soviet summers, scorching hot, and the miserable rainy seasons of spring and fall, known as the Rasputitsa, turned roads into waterlogged obstacles, making the fight against the elements as formidable as the enemy itself. In the wake of the devastating defeat at Stalingrad, the German forces were left reeling, caught in a relentless tide of Soviet advances. It was a time of uncertainty and desperation as the Red Army, fueled by newfound confidence and resources, relentlessly pushed the Germans back. The Battle of Kursk, a colossal clash of tanks and men, further tilted the scales in favor of the Soviets. The German forces, having suffered substantial losses, had no choice but to retreat once again. The Eastern Front, once a battleground where the Germans held the upper hand, was now witness to a determined Soviet offensive. As the Red Army pressed westward, reclaiming territory that had been under German control for years, the nature of the conflict evolved. Fierce urban warfare became the norm, with cities and towns becoming deadly battlegrounds. The siege of Leningrad, a symbol of Soviet resistance, was finally lifted, and the Red Army's momentum carried them into Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. For the German soldiers on the ground, it was a harrowing experience. The once seemingly invincible army now found itself in a series of strategic retreats, each one marked by the harsh reality of war. The conditions were brutal, with both sides facing the unforgiving Eastern European winter and the toll of constant combat. These battles were not just about territory. They were struggles for survival. The German forces faced not only the military might of the Red Army, but also the harshness of the environment and the overwhelming numerical superiority of their adversaries. It was a dark chapter in the history of World War II, where the tides had turned, and the once formidable German war machine found itself on the defensive against a resurgent and determined Soviet Union.
Such is the fate of armies led by men with unchecked, unchained egos out of control. For Donald Trump, China is his Eastern Front, an empire of steel, silicon, and unbreakable economic endurance. He thinks the old, rugged dragon will capitulate, that a flood of tariffs and embargoes will bend it to America's will. Yet China, like the Soviet Union of old, has been preparing for this world trade war long before Donald Trump declared it and fired the first shot. The dragon has diversified trade routes, secured alternative suppliers, and deepened economic ties with Africa, Latin America, and Russia. In fact, with a precision born of relentless ambition, the industrialists of the East have marshaled their forces, each a standard-bearer of a new technological vanguard. Their electric vehicles, sculpted in the foundries of an emergent empire and much cheaper than America's Tesla, glide onto European roads, from the modest city hatchback to the stately luxury sedan, a testament to China's resolve to reshape the contours of industry. Rather than succumbing, China will retaliate in kind, weaponizing its vast consumer market and technological hegemony against the United States. American farmers, manufacturers, and tech giants will find themselves besieged not by foreign tanks, but by collapsing supply chains and inaccessible markets. Like the Germans who froze outside Moscow, American industries will bleed under the weight of a battle they cannot win. The Western Front, the enemies at home. When Hitler launched his ill-fated war upon the Soviet Union, he had not yet vanquished the West. Britain still stood, America still lurked beyond the Atlantic, and the resistance movements of France, the Netherlands, and Poland brewed in defiance. Instead of finishing one war, he began another, leaving his flank vulnerable to the greatest amphibious invasion in human history. Donald Trump, in his war against the world, is committing the same error. Even as he wages economic war upon China, he levies tariffs upon Europe, thrashes Canada, antagonizes Mexico, and clashes with South America. He burns bridges with old allies even as new adversaries prepare their counterattacks. In doing so, he unifies a global coalition against him, the very thing Hitler did by forcing the Western allies into an inseparable bond with the Soviets. The European Union, once dependent upon American trade, is pivoting toward China. Canada and Mexico are restructuring their economies to lessen their reliance on American exports. Who can blame them? As Bob Marley and the Wailers sang, "Man to man is so unjust. Your worst enemy could be your best friend, and your best friend your worst enemy." For only your friend knows your secrets and only he can reveal them. People, you have no idea how the sting of America's betrayal is deeply felt in Canada and Mexico. The BRICS nations, sensing an opportunity, are strengthening their resolve against American economic dominance. And so, as Hitler fought in Russia and was overwhelmed in France, Trump will soon find himself assailed from all sides. His own industries will collapse under retaliatory tariffs, his own allies forging new economic paths that will leave the U.S. behind. The internal collapse, war against oneself. Wars of aggression do not merely exhaust the invader's resources, they turn the blade inward, carving at the foundations of the empire itself. By 1944, Germany had not only lost external battles, its economy was in ruins, its population starving, its soldiers weary beyond repair. Hitler's obsession with victory blinded him to the cries of his people, and in the end his own empire disintegrated from within. Trump's world trade war, in its blind ambition, is inflicting the same self-inflicted wounds. American consumers will bear the weight of tariffs, paying higher prices for goods that were once affordable. Farmers in the Midwest, deprived of access to Chinese markets, will watch their livelihoods erode. The stock market will convulse under uncertainty while corporate America, dependent on international trade, will begin to look elsewhere for stability. Trump, like Hitler, forgets that war is never fought without consequences at home. The psychological toll of a multi-front trade war. The burden of war is not measured only in economic losses. It is also measured in the spirit of a nation. A war fought in the realm of trade is no less insidious than one waged with guns, bombs, and missiles, for it strikes at the very soul of a people. The weight of tariffs, the sting of joblessness, and the creeping specter of economic despair press upon the American working class like an iron yoke, tightening with each passing day. Just as the German people, bombarded by food shortages and military conscriptions, began to lose faith in their Führer, so too will America's MAGA and working class, caught in the crossfire of multiple front trade wars, begin to question the wisdom of their dear leader, the very stable genius. Just as the German laborer, weary from rations and fatigued by conscription, began to turn his eyes toward the crumbling edifice of his nation's leadership, so too will the American laborer soon question the wisdom of his own king. Trade wars, waged in the high chambers of government, spill downward into the streets, where they breed anxiety and doubt in those who must bear their cost. The price of bread rises, the wage stagnates, the factory closes its doors. The march of uncertainty is relentless, and with each step it hollows the spirit of a nation once certain of its dominance. A people accustomed to prosperity now find themselves beset by an unfamiliar fear, an erosion of faith in the promise of their own economic security. This is not merely a battle of industry or commerce, it is a struggle for the very belief in the future. A nation that turns its might against the world finds itself, in time, turning against its own. A house divided, held together by fraying bonds of trust, cannot long endure. Suspicion grows between worker and employer, citizen and state, as the foundation of confidence gives way to the rot of doubt. The war of tariffs and retaliations is not fought solely in boardrooms or government halls. It is fought in the hearts and minds of those who wonder if the American empire, in its pursuit of dominance, is, in truth, unraveling. The reckoning of Overreach. The lesson of history is clear. No empire, however mighty, can wage war on all fronts and expect to emerge unscathed. The world does not bow to the will of one man, nor do nations surrender their economic sovereignty to the pressure of tariffs and decrees. Hitler's Germany, stretched thin, battered on all sides, collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. Trump's America, isolated by its own hand, finds itself in a war without allies, a battle without end. And in the end, the fate of all those who overreach awaits. A reckoning written not in fire and blood, but in the slow, grinding reality of economic decline. If you find this content illuminating, please subscribe, give us a thumbs up, and share with your loved ones. And of course, we would like to hear from you. So drop us a comment. This will enable us to bring you more analytical content of this nature. Thank you for watching.